The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon is a complex, high fantasy novel with a strong focus on religious division. Throughout the novel, we follow 4 points of view: Tanya and Dr. Roos in the east, and Arteleth Beck and Iad in the west. The book itself is a massive 804 pages, not including the glossary and other bits and pieces in the back, but it's a standalone novel, something that's quite unusual for the high fantasy genre. The book is just as complex as a trilogy though, and Samantha Shannon does an excellent job of slowly trickling information into the story so that the reader doesn't get overwhelmed. It came out in 2019 and is the author's 5th novel, although at the point of recording this I haven't read any of her other work. I absolutely adored this book. The premise is a world divided between dragon worshippers and dragon haters, although the 4 religions most present in the novel are of course far more complicated than just that. Nowadays, when anyone starts talking about dragons in a medieval setting, one tends to start to think of a Game of Thrones, and if your copy of The Priory of the Orange Tree is like mine, you can see that the publisher has decided to capitalize on this by putting a quote on the front that reads, "Deserves to be as big as Game of Thrones." Which I have to say that I agree with. I would love to see a TV adaptation of this novel, although perhaps not written by the same people. But it does mean that when I picked up this novel, I did have that series in my head when I started reading. Which is a shame because this book is nothing like Game of Thrones, nor even the source material, A Song of Ice and Fire. I ended up being okay because I wasn't looking for a Game of Thrones lookalike when I decided to purchase this book in my local bookstore. But I worry that there are going to be people who are looking for that and are disappointed when this book isn't as gory or adult as that series. Or the opposite, in fact, that they want to get away from Game of Thrones so they don't buy it in the first place. So be rest assured this is not a GOT lookalike, and if you enjoy fantasy generally but didn't like GOT or are just tired of it, this is its own book and I think you'll enjoy it. In this video, I want to explore how Samantha Shannon discusses religion in her book, but it will contain spoilers, although not for everything that happens in the novel. Some mysteries will remain intact, but if you don't want to hear any spoilers anyway, I've put a timestamp in the description that you can jump to avoid them. 3, 2, 1, go. As I've already touched on, dragons are hugely important to the religions of this world. In the east, water dragons are worshipped as deities, and the western fire dragons, and the plague they bring with them, are feared. This is the belief system of Tanya, our main character in the east, who is in training to become a Medici, a dragon-riding warrior. The Emperor rules beside a Dragon King, although the details of this system aren't fully fleshed out within the story. But towards the end of the novel, we come to learn that at least in the Empire of the 12 Lakes, the Emperor rules the people and the Dragon King rules the dragons. Whether that's the setup in Siki, Tanya's country, we just don't know. In the West, however, both subspecies of dragons are treated with revulsion. Most Western countries believe that 1,000 years ago, a man they now call the Saint took up a sword against the Nameless One, the leader of the fire dragons, during a time of great suffering. He defeated the Nameless One, driving him back into the abyss, and in doing so won the heart of the damsel, and together they created a religion in Innis that they called Virtudom, which has spread through the Western continent. Starting with the saint and the damsel, every monarch has had a single daughter who is said to have the soul of the saint, and if that family line should perish, it is said that the Nameless One will return from the abyss. This is a religion of Arteleth Beck, our secondary point of view character in the West. It is also the former religion of Dr. Roos, the secondary character in the East, who seems to be more of an atheist now. But this is not the only religion in the West. In the south of the Western continent there exists a secret society called the Priory of the Orange Tree. Here exists a group of women that believe an alternative version of events to those of Virtudom and train their whole lives to become warriors and magic users, to protect people from dragons and dragonkind alike. They believe that the mother, whom those of Virtudom call the damsel, was the one to take up her sword against the Nameless One after the saint fled in fear. The mother never asked nor needed to be saved by the saint, and indeed never ran away with him to get married and start this line of successes. Instead, after defeating the Nameless One, she hid and started the Priory, knowing that the Nameless One would arise again whether there was a queen in Innis or not. The people of the Priory eat the fruit of the orange tree, which grants them magical powers, although they must continually eat the fruit in order to keep this power. This is the religion of Iad, our main character in the West. But there is one final religion in the West that needs to be talked about, the religion of the Draconic Kingdom of Yiskalin. Yiskalin was, until very recently in the novel, a kingdom of virtudom, until one night the borders were closed and the royal family announced that they would be worshipping fire dragons and the Nameless One. It is later revealed in the novel, through the character of Artolith Beck, that the Nameless One's right hand had risen and threatened the kingdom. In order to save his people, the king of Yiskalin had agreed to become the flesh king of the Nameless One, and his country was soon overrun with dragons and dragonkind who spread the plague. What I find particularly fascinating is what each of these religions say about and how they reflect each other. Let's take the religion of Siki and the Draconic Kingdom of Yiskalin, for example. Both treat dragons as deities to be worshipped. They both use puppet kings through which the head dragon rules. Both countries have since closed their borders as well, but the seemingly obvious difference is that the water dragons of the east are benevolent rulers, whereas the fire dragons are vicious and rule through fear. But have the water dragons always been so benevolent? As a reader, we don't know all that much about the East, primarily because the countries of the East are very secretive, and our only point of view character, who is native of the East, grew up poor and outside of the inner circles of their government. She's also a true believer, so she doesn't exactly go looking for chinks in their armor either. But what we do know is that dragons are terrifying and intelligent creatures, and that they aren't true gods in this world. They are actively deceiving the population of the East. They aren't just trying to help out, they are trying to rule. And the regime in Siki as well as Yiskalin is vicious. For example, as the soldiers led her towards Janira jailhouse, the hum of insects snatched her gaze upwards. 3 fly-blown heads, bloated with decay, watched the street from the gate above. Tanya stared at the freshest of them, the thatch of hair taut with blood, the tongue puffy in death. His features had already slackened, but she recognized him. Now let's compare this passage to one from the point of view of Artolith Beck in Yiskalin. It was too late. He had seen the men and women chained by their wrists to the gate. Some looked dead or half dead already, but others were alive and bloody, fighting their restraints. "That is how we keep them fed, Lord Artoloth," Lady Priessa said, "with our criminals and our traitors." Now, obviously there is a difference between killing criminals and then hanging them up as an example, considering that this is a medieval setting, that is, and hanging up those criminals to be eaten alive by dragons. But I think it's important to note that it's also heavily implied that the man Tanya sees was tortured first before being killed, and torture is still torture in its many different forms. It's also important to note that at one point a traitor's dead body is hung from the gate in Innis in the west. But that alone is considered barbaric and disrespectful, and the person was not tortured beforehand. But to be fair, the person is a noble of sorts, and so it's hard to tell if that opinion is reserved for people of their stature, or if it's applied equally throughout the kingdom. My point is that within the context of the world of the Priory of the Orange Tree, whilst the actions of the Draconic Kingdom of Yiskalin are like a 10 on the deplorable actions scale, I would put Sikia probably an 8. Given the similarities between the two religions, similarities they don't share with the non-draconic kingdoms of the West, I just find it fascinating, and if we examine it from our own historical perspective, in all likelihood when the East was establishing its religion, it may have had a much stronger resemblance to the current Yiskalin than is strictly comfortable. Then let's look at the religion of the Priory and that of virtudom. I mean, the similarities are obvious since they come from a different version of the same origin story, but for me, what looking at these two religions say in contrast are the dangers of misinformation and religious rhetoric. It's most obvious with virtudom, so we can take a look there first. At some point in the early stages of the religious settlement, the saint, or one of his successors, established the idea that if their lineage were to stop existing, a monstrous creature would return and the people's lives, as they know it, would become a living hell. Which, as a strategy for ensuring your citizens don't want to destroy your lineage, is an excellent tactic. But the downside to that is that as a society they never prepared for the idea of the fire dragons returning, leaving them in a vulnerable position. And it also would have served to stifle any ideas people had to prepare in the event of the death of the Queen, because to do so would mean possibly implying not just treason but blasphemy. It could look like they were preparing to kill their monarch, or that they didn't believe that the saint would protect her like the doctrine dictated. They became sitting ducks so that one particular family could rule in comfort. Whereas the Priory, with their own religion, have trained for thousands of years for this eventuality and are prepared for this disaster. Except they have their own religious rhetoric problem. Thousands of years of despising the saint for his lies and slander against the mother has, for the most part, alienated them from the rest of society. Repeating this rhetoric, living in isolation, and holding this anger amongst themselves allowed the idea that the rest of the world didn't deserve their protection to fester. How could all those people believe the saint's lies, even though we, who are the only people to know the truth and frankly speaking have all the evidence, have never even attempted to convince anyone otherwise? How could they believe that with no counter-narrative available at all? It's ridiculous, but that's what isolation combined with doctrine does to people. And it's this belief that almost leads to the Nameless One successfully rising again. They became too insular and didn't feel a connection with the people they were training to protect. It is only because Iad is apart from them for so long that she has the chance to feel differently. Now that's barely scratching the surface with what I think these religions say about each other and the wider world at large, but since I promised to leave some mysteries intact, I'm afraid I can't dive deeper without giving away everything. But now that the people who didn't want to be spoiled are back with us, let's take an overall look at the novel. The structure of the book is extremely well done. Like I said at the beginning, the reader swaps between 4 points of view, which I think is perfect for a novel of this size. I never felt bored or bogged down because every point of view was bringing something fresh to the story. Some of the romances that take place within the story did feel a bit forced to me, mainly because it was meant to be a surprise to the point of view character themselves, so it sprung on you. But I'm looking forward to rereading to see if I can spot it, knowing what's going to happen. And I do think this is a very rereadable book. I don't know if this happens to many other people, but sometimes I finish a book that I enjoyed and appreciated, but I don't really want to read it a second time. Usually because the language was difficult or the subject was particularly heavy, so it was mentally taxing to read. This is not the case with this novel, so I'm very much looking forward to rereading it soon. And the writing itself, so many times I just had to pause while I was reading to appreciate a sentence. I mean, listen to this one. I swear there's no spoilers in it. Tanya looked over her shoulder one last time, taking in the lush green hills and the silhouettes of larch trees against the pale blue sky. Then she stitched her gaze to the horizon. It's gorgeous. Not only is that a wonderful metaphor on its own, but it suits the character and the situation she's in really well. And speaking of gorgeous, can we take a minute to appreciate how beautiful the front cover of this book is? I know you've been staring at it like this whole time, but it's such a gorgeous design, and it's so vibrant. I highly recommend just going into a bookstore and taking a look in person because this printout doesn't do it justice. I am enamored with pretty much every aspect of this book. I would recommend this to anyone who is a fan of fantasy, but if I can be a bit more specific in my recommendation, I think this is an excellent bridging novel for someone who is used to reading YA fantasy fiction, which is a little bit easier to read, and is looking to branch into the more intimidating adult fantasy fiction. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to this channel and want to see more, please subscribe and ring the bell if you want to be notified whenever I post a video. If you have any thoughts on the Priory of the Orange Tree, feel free to sound off below. It would be interesting to hear what you all think of it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all next time.